So the United States is just about to hit the debt ceiling once again. We are just $78 billion away from another debt crisis and a standoff in Congress. But here's the truth, guys. It's just a dog and pony show. The United States cannot afford to default on its debt, at least in the traditional sense. America's debt right now is almost at $31.4 trillion and is on the brink of reaching the borrowing cap by the third quarter this year. But I have a feeling it will be much faster than we expect. We could see back in December 2021, Congress raised the debt ceiling from 29 trillion to around 31.4 trillion, but I can almost guarantee that in 2023, America's going to raise the debt ceiling once again and it's going to reach another historic level. Now, there are many headlines about how there's going to be a titanic battle between the Republicans and the Democrats, how one side wants to keep spending forever and the other wants to push the country to default, how the world's stash of US treasuries is going to be defaulted on, right? But the reality is the debt ceiling will be raised, guys. America, they are sandwiched in a very difficult position and they have no choice but to kick the can down the road again. Yes, there might be gridlock, and sure, the Republicans could squeeze concessions such as deeper spending cuts from Biden, but the end result will be still more deficit spending and more borrowing of money and an inflation nightmare that just won't end. And we need to discuss why, even though the United States won't default on its debt, you are still screwed. The debt tsunami is building and the whole world is in deep trouble. By now, I think we can all agree that America has an insane inflation crisis, right? This is what happens when you combine decades of deficit spending and the Federal Reserve printing trillions of dollars to prop up the zombie economy. You have increased the money supply by such a gigantic amount that massive inflation was inevitable. We're at a point where America has to keep borrowing money to continue the current inflation fight. Now, I know this sounds very contradictory and on the surface, this doesn't make any sense, but let me explain. The Federal Reserve, they're trying to crush inflation by causing demand destruction, and their strategy is by raising interest rates so that people will be too scared to borrow and spend. Companies will not be able to grow as fast and they eventually have to either cut wages or outright fire people, right? Because when people are broke, they can't spend money, so inflation comes down. Now, Jerome Powell, he has no choice but to keep hiking rates because he can't control the supply side of the equation, right? He can't just walk into Ukraine, convince Putin to end the war, and pump more oil. It won't happen, so he can only crush demand. But I want us to notice that the Federal Reserve is tiptoeing their way with the rate hikes. Powell is not a Powell Volcker. He's slowly hiking rates by 50 to 75 basis points a clip because he knows the US economy is fragile, right? He can't just raise rates by 4 or 5% at once because that would collapse the economy. Powell is trying to gradually crush economic demand but not cause the next financial crisis and be labeled as the bad guy, right? He wants a controlled demolition. Now, the US debt has ballooned to a monstrous size. The interest payments alone is over $100 billion in the first 2 months of this current fiscal year. And that's an insane $50 billion a month or 11% of total federal spending on interest payments just to keep the boat afloat, right? So just imagine if America defaults on the debt, Congress suddenly decides not to pay the interest payments on the debt, and bondholders, they all get rug pulled, right? We'll see interest rates just spike to the moon and bond values just crash to hell. We will see credit agencies actually downgrade US bonds, which did happen before in 2011 thanks to the debt ceiling standoff, right? US treasuries went from AAA to AA plus, which was a slap to the face. And this is why the United States will raise the debt ceiling. If they allow a default, the entire economy will collapse. Mortgages will go through the roof, Wall Street will crash and burn, plus there'll be massive layoffs on the street. Plus, here's the irony, guys. A total collapse in the US economy could actually send inflation higher in the short term because now the supply of goods and services will be affected, plus the dollar will be kaput, right? The Federal Reserve, they need the wiggle room to raise rates slowly without any shocks, so we can expect the US Congress to raise the debt ceiling again. Now, reason number two is the obvious one. The debt ceiling will be raised because the United States is still in a proxy war in Ukraine. And the last time we checked, wars are expensive and they cost a lot of money. And let's look at the situation from the perspective of the United States. You have just approved another $45 billion package for Zelensky, and that is on top of the previous $48 billion sent throughout 2022. And this brings the total amount of money to almost $100 billion, and that is a ton of cash. But here's the thing, you're probably not done yet. The Russians, they're not surrendering and their revenues, they are still flowing. The oil price cap you conjured up with the G7 isn't really working because China and India, they're still buying tons of crude from Russia, right? You can't put boots on the ground as well without further escalation. So the only playbook left is to send weapons and aid to Ukraine, and that costs a lot of money. And we need to understand that there are obviously many elements to warfare, right? The fighting force, the advanced technology, and ground tactics, they are all key elements to winning. But a big factor is your war chest. How much money do you have to outlast the opposition? And in this case, it's the Russians. The United States, they've sanctioned away Russia's reserves, and now they're trying to squeeze Putin's oil revenues, right? But the Russians, they're still chugging along. And let's remember Russia and China, they are tag teaming the United States on the financial front. China's dumping tons of US treasuries and trying to get the Middle East to de-dollarize by selling their oil for the Chinese yuan. Plus, Russia is now all in with yuan and gold. They no longer have any dollar assets in their reserves. And we have to ask ourselves, why are they doing this? Now, on the surface, it is to secure their assets from Western sanctions. That's 100% true. While bigger agendas likely to put upwards pressure on US borrowing costs. Every time China dumps US bonds or Russia de-dollarizes, it causes yields to stay high, making it more costly for the Americans to borrow money to fund their military aid. Basically, they are trying to bankrupt the United States. And this is a battle of financial attrition. How much inflation, how much deficit spending can America endure? And this is why Congress will raise the debt ceiling. They have no choice if they want to keep borrowing costs relatively stable and the world to still loan money to the United States. And to default on the debt is to actually destroy trust in the US financial system, the US dollar, and reach the reserve currency status. Let's recall that the dollar is now less than 59% of global FX reserves. It is losing market share, and de-dollarization is only gonna get worse. Because if the dollar loses the reserve status due to a debt default, we are going to see countries dumping their stockpiles of treasuries and US dollars. Both are now hot potatoes. As a result, inflation will circle back to the United States. Domestic inflation will soar. And this is why a debt default will be unthinkable, especially at this point in time where America is still funding Ukraine to fight the Russians. And the final reason why the United States won't default yet is because America is almost a welfare state. Even if you put aside the Ukraine conflict or the Federal Reserve's inflation fight, these alone will make Congress raise the debt ceiling. Defaulting will mean untold amounts of suffering and pain in a country that's very reliant on welfare from the federal government. The White House has even written a doomsday article titled Life After Default that goes through how unthinkable a default will be, especially the effects on the American people. And according to the article, in 2020, 50 million residents received retirement benefits through Social Security, and over 60 million people across America are on Medicare, 75 million are enrolled in Medicaid, and those are just two of the bigger federal programs. And if we dig into the numbers further, we can see that in 2022, an average of 66 million Americans receive a Social Security benefit, and the average amount they get is above $1,600 a month. Now, I'm not against Social Security. I believe having certain safety nets is necessary for the most vulnerable, but this debt burden is crushing the US economy. We are talking about over $1 trillion a year at the very least. And let's empathize a little because people who take Social Security checks are probably struggling quite a bit. We are in inflation hell right now where food and energy prices they are going up, right? This is a serious cost of living crisis. In fact, Social Security benefits are going to rise by more than $140 a month in 2023, and that's an 8.7% adjustment up, which is going to balloon the national debt even more because deficit spending is going to get out of hand. So just imagine if America defaults and refuses to raise the debt ceiling, right? We're going to see economic and social destruction across the country. For the 2 million people on SNAP, the food stamp program will be affected, housing assistance will evaporate, and there'll be more homeless people around. And this is why the coming debt standoff and showdown is just posturing, guys. America might be fine with defaulting on the world, but they don't want to default on their own people. It's much better in the short term to run deficits to keep the wheel turning and the social security checks coming. Now, this is where things get interesting, right? Obviously, you can't run deficits forever. and the world isn't that stupid to keep lending money that won't be repaid. In a study by the Peterson Foundation, the federal debt to GDP will hit an insane 185% by 2052, and more importantly, interest payments will exceed 40% of federal revenues. And let's remember that interest rates are rising, making the repayments more expensive. So this projection is very conservative. And this means there's a limit to how much America can borrow, right? They'll keep raising the debt ceiling until one day the interest costs will eclipse federal revenues. And ladies and gentlemen, there'll be the turning point. That is when there's no more road left to kick the can, and at that point, the United States will likely start to print money to pay off the debt. And I think by now we know that printing money to try and solve economic problems is becoming the most popular solution out there. And I have a strong conviction that the only way left is to inflate the debt away. So let's put aside the possibility of the US doing a traditional default. And when I mean traditional default, I mean by not paying the interest on a national debt to keep the ball rolling, right? America will have two ways to inflate the debt away: the easy way and the complicated way. Now let's talk about the easy way first, and that is to lower interest rates and start to burn away the debt with inflation. Now, this is the brain dead simple strategy because when money is now cheap, inflation will cause the prices of everything to soar, and that includes federal revenues. So the US can rake in double or triple the revenues while the debt amount remains the same. The nominal dollar value of federal revenues goes up, and they can use those cheaper dollars to pay back the bondholders. And if interest rates are 1 or 2%, but inflation is running hot at 10% or more, paying back the debt will be easy, guys. But of course, that is assuming the US government stops borrowing additional money. And the more complicated solution is one that Lynn Alden outlined in her Debt Jubilee article, but with some modifications I made. Now, the US government could simply issue 100-year 0% interest bonds to just the Federal Reserve. Basically, the Treasury will get the Fed to print money from thin air without owing additional interest to their central bank. Really think about this, guys. This is money printing at its finest. For example, the United States, they can issue $31.4 trillion of 0% bonds that will mature in 100 years to Jerome Powell. Powell will then take those bonds, he'll print $31.4 trillion that the Treasury can now use to pay back all the bondholders tomorrow, right? They can pay back Japan, they can pay back China, and everyone else what they owe. And I have to say, this is not a stretch because the Federal Reserve already owns the majority of government holdings of the national debt. They own nearly $6 trillion of US bonds. Now, while this is an instant solution, it will crush the value of the dollar and cause massive inflation back into US. Now, countries, if they see this, they will immediately turn around and spend their dollars back in the United States, right? They'll snap out hard assets like no tomorrow. I'm talking about real estate, farmland, and precious metals. And that's why I'm leaning towards America inflating the debt away by simply lowering rates down the road. Sooner or later, Jerome Powell will do a pause and a pivot. He will have to slash rates, which means we are still screwed. The end game is either going to be inflation from money printing or inflation by lowering rates. It's the same ending, guys. It's just a different journey towards an inflation hell. And that's why hard assets are just so essential. You need to invest and protect your wealth or really watch it evaporate. And this is one reason why I keep a portion of my money outside of financial system. Real estate, gold, and silver, all these store value. All we need to do is to take a look at the price of gold, which is the ultimate barometer for the dying dollar. We can see since the start of 2022, gold has actually stored value better than stock market in an environment of insane inflation and higher rates. It is up over 4%, while everything else from the S&P to Bitcoin has been crashing down. And there's a reason why gold is pushing back towards all-time highs, right? It is telling the world that inflation is a clear and present danger, and the US dollar is in deep trouble. It is losing value like no tomorrow, and people are rushing to gold. Now, I've come to the point that I don't care if you buy gold or not, right? I just want you to store your money in an asset that will scale with inflation. You need to hedge your purchasing power. So if real estate makes more sense where you come from, do that, right? If buying land is more of your thing, you can farm or develop homes on it. That sounds like a fantastic idea. But let's not end on a doom and gloom note. Can America turn this ship around and avoid defaulting or printing money? Now, technically, it is possible, guys. It is just an equation. The deficit is just an equation. For example, in 2022, the government spent $6.27 trillion while only collecting 4.9 trillion, which is why there's a deficit of 1.38 trillion, which has to be borrowed, right? Now, if the US government controls their spending and slashes their budgets, they could avoid borrowing money and just rely on revenues to run the country, and that would be a balanced budget. In fact, America actually had a surplus back in 2021. The federal budget was actually net positive, and that money could be used to pay down the debt. But it's going to take a titanic effort today. It will involve cutting back on many federal programs, reduce defense spending, stopping the war funding, and finding a way to gradually lower interest rates. Now, I find it rather unlikely today given the political climate, but hey, miracles can happen, right? However, we live in reality, guys, and it's best to prepare for the coming debt crisis. Now, inflation will be the easier path for the US government to pay back their debt. Now, it might not happen in the next 5 or 10 years, but it is inevitable considering the path we are on. But once that happens, the world will be terrified to lend the US money, which will make growth much slower going forward. So I want us to understand that all this debt standoff or showdown is just a show. It's a dog and pony show. The debt ceiling will be raised and inflation is still going to be a painful problem 5, 10, or 20 years from now. Federal spending and borrowing will not end, and that's why we have to prepare with hard assets. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Will the United States actually do the unthinkable and default? Or will they inflate the debt away and leave everyone holding the bag? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.